Hosting our discussion today is Darren Baxter, Research Fellow in Agricultural Policy, part of our Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies. Darren writes and studies on agriculture subsidies, property rights, environmental policy, food labeling, and related issues. Prior to joining us earlier this year, he was a policy counsel for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, where he focused on regulatory reform as well as food and agriculture policy. He has also served as Director of Legal and Regulatory Studies for 7 years at the John Locke Foundation in North Carolina. He serves on the Federalist Society's Environmental Law and Property Rights Executive Committee, and previously was a member of the Energy, Environment, and Agriculture Task Force of the American Legislative Exchange Council. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Darren Baxter. Darren?
Thank you, John. I appreciate it. And I want to thank everybody who has come here today and also those watching online. The title of today's event focuses on GMO labeling, and certainly we're going to talk about GMO labeling today. But I also wanted this event to focus on providing some of the background on GMOs, and in particular some of the myths and the facts that actually exist, and try to kind of dispel some of those myths that exist out there, as well as some of the scare tactics that are out there and kind of scare the public about genetically modified foods. The reason why holding this event is there's a lot going on when it comes to GMOs. This is a particularly important time in this country, and we can basically head down two paths. We can head down a path kind of like Europe, where we simply are scared of GMOs and we don't welcome GMOs, and we wind up hurting our citizens and also actually undermine GMOs and their use in developing countries that desperately need genetically modified foods to help feed their citizens. Of course, the other path is, and the one that I hope that we take, is one of sound science and sound policy. And I hope that's one we take, and that ultimately that sound science wins the day. We have three panelists today who will inform us about these critical issues. And what's going to happen is after they present, I'll ask a couple of questions, and then there'll be plenty of time for Q&A from the audience. The presenter closest to me, and who will be presenting first, is Val Giddings. And Val will be discussing the science behind GMOs to try to lay the foundation for our discussion today. Val joined the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation as Senior Fellow after nearly 3 decades of experience in science and regulatory policy relating to biotechnology innovations in agriculture and biomedicine. He served for 8 years as Vice President for Food and Agriculture of the Biotechnology Industry Organization, BIO. For BIO, he spent 8 years with the Biotech Products Regulatory Division of the USDA, Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. And while with the USDA in that capacity, he was International Team Leader and Branch Chief for Science and Policy Coordination. To your far right is Greg Conco, and Greg will be discussing the question of GMO labeling. Greg is Executive Director and a Senior Fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, where his research focuses on food and drug regulation. He is a co-author of the forthcoming American Council on Science and Health report, Food and You, A Guide to Modern Agricultural Biotechnology, and his book, The Frankenfood Myth, How Protests and Politics Threaten the Biotech Revolution, which he co-authored with Henry I. Miller, was named by Barron's as one of the 25 best books of 2004. And then finally, last but certainly not least, is Julie Gunlock, and she'll be discussing some of the GMO scare tactics that exist. Julie is director of the Independent Women's Forum Culture of Alarmism Project. Before joining IWF, Julie served as a professional staff member on the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, and on the House Homeland Security Committee, and on the staffs of Ohio Senators Mike DeWine and George Voinovich. She's a regular contributor to the National Review Online, Blog Her, and Huffington Post. And she has a new book coming out in November, which is called From Cupcakes to Chemicals, How the Culture of Alarmism makes us afraid of everything and how to fight back. And just check the IWF website to learn more about that. And again, that's coming out in November. At this point, we'll turn to Val.
Thank you, Darren. Thanks to all of you for giving up your lunch hour. It's great to be here. I could talk about the topic for today for days, and I've left a lot out, but I hope to give you at least a brief introduction. I wanted to provide first some context within which I think this conversation should take place. And that is that the greatest challenge of the 21st century is feeding 9 billion people with a sustainable agricultural production system. So that, to my mind at least, is a backdrop for the conversation about GMOs and food and labeling. A question that comes up on the topic of labeling is, why do advocates seek mandatory GM labels? The term GM, just as a side note, from a scientific point of view, I am not a fan of this term. I tend not to use it unless someone else introduces it into the conversation, because in point of fact, it's misleading. Virtually everything that appears on a dinner plate anywhere on the planet, indeed every living organism on Earth, is genetically modified. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. But the term is used as a pejorative term to raise concerns. And some folks claim that material produced through techniques of modern biotechnology, which they term genetic modification, is something that's important and should be included on a food label. The two main criteria that are usually advanced as justification for demand for mandatory labels are to provide consumer information and to enable consumers to have freedom of choice and the ability to avoid foods improved through biotechnology. The purpose for this provision of information, which is sought through mandatory labels, is to respond to safety concerns that have been raised and respond to the argument that folks have a right to know what they're eating. These arguments are both interesting in different ways. I think the right to know argument is the most interesting of the two, but let's talk a little bit for a minute about the safety concerns that have been raised. What is a GMO? As I said, in fact, anything living is a GMO. GMO, genetic modification. Charles Darwin showed us in 1859 that the fundamental underlying principle of all life on Earth is descent with modification. From a scientific point of view, I'm a geneticist by training and background, specializing in the study of natural populations. Everything on Earth is genetically modified. This is just a fact of science, a fact of genetics, and we've been aware of this for at least 150 years. You all will recognize this. I don't actually know whether this ear of corn has been modified through recombinant DNA techniques. If you give me a lab and the appropriate reagents and machinery, I can tell you within a day or so. But let's assume that it's not been changed through recombinant DNA techniques in a lab. There are those who would therefore call this natural corn, and the alternative varieties that have been improved through in vitro recombinant DNA techniques would call that unnatural. But the fact of the matter is that this is as unnatural as food gets. If you want to see what natural corn looks like, this is teosinte, the grass-like ancestor from which all modern corn has been derived. And anyone who thinks you can get from this to this without a lot of genetic modification is sadly mistaken. In point of actual fact, producing this from this was accomplished over about 10 millennia, in effect by people who had no idea what they were doing, wearing boxing gloves, working at night in a fog, with no predictability, nothing other than the ability to look at their harvest and decide, this one has traits that I favor, so I'll save the seeds from this. And you keep doing that for 10 millennia, and you can get from this to this. With modern recombinant DNA techniques, we can effect much more quickly substantial changes with an unprecedented degree of precision and predictability, and therefore safety assurance. But nevertheless, the term genetic modification, or GMO, is used incorrectly to refer to an organism whose genetic material has been altered using genetic engineering techniques in ways not found in nature. But this too, you'll find a whole host of variations of this definition on the web, but this too is profoundly mistaken. The techniques that we use to affect recombinant DNA insertions into different varieties of crops, in glass, in the lab, those techniques are all directly derived from what we see in nature. The enzymes that we use, we discovered them in nature and figured out how they worked. And then we figured out how to use them in the lab. These techniques are about as natural as they get. Some argue that moving genes between species is what makes them unnatural. This corn, 50% of the DNA in it is DNA of viral origin that has been moved by transposable elements akin to viruses from other species. In fact, the single most common gene in each of us sitting in this room is a sequence of viral origin that makes up 7% of our genome. Movement of genes between species is extremely common in nature. Indeed, it is the rule, not the exception. As for the safety of crops derived through biotechnology improvements, there have been an endless array of analyses done by authoritative bodies around the world. The competent authoritative bodies that have looked at this question are unanimous in their conclusion. They are firmly of the view that crops and foods improved through biotechnology are as safe as, if not safer than, those produced in any other way, conventional or organic. Don't take my word for it. I hope that this PowerPoint will be shared. The links in it are active URLs, and they'll direct you to a host of additional material if you'd like to do some more homework on these questions. The first of these is a massive review that just appeared in the past 2 weeks of the scientific literature on this topic. It's also featured in a posting that just came out this morning on the Genetic Literacy Project. If you go and Google John Entine or Genetic Literacy Project, you'll find a nice write-up on it. And this provides an overview of the last 10 years, just the last 10 years of genetically engineered crop research, containing about 1,800 studies, in which there is not a single credible report that conveys information relating to a potential or realized threat to biodiversity, the environment, or human health. The second link contains a compilation of expert views from academies of science and related authoritative bodies around the world, academies of science and medicine. The third link takes you to a report of a 2-decade-long project conducted by the European Union. Some of the critics of crops and foods improved through biotechnology will argue that all these safety studies that I've been mentioned are invalid or dubious because they've been funded by industry, and industry-funded scientists have vested interest in a particular outcome. The facts show otherwise. This third link provides a summary of research funded by the European Union, conducted by 400 independent research groups and teams in the European Union over the past 2.5 decades, at about $85 million euros, if I remember correctly. And they concluded at the end of it that if there is a safety differential between crops and foods improved through biotechnology and those derived through other means, that the differential likely favors the biotech crops and foods because they are subjected to more scrutiny in advance, in depth and detail, than any others in human history. And the final link contains an additional story in which Ann Glover, the chief EU science advisor, follows up on issues related to these themes. We often also hear that the Food and Drug Administration doesn't test these foods, and in the United States, safety is not required, and they were all part of an experiment. So I think it's worth looking for a minute at what it is that FDA actually does with foods derived from crops improved through biotechnology. They refer to these foods as bioengineered foods. And just as with all other foods, bioengineered foods are required by law the FDA is responsible for administering, that these foods must be safe. All foods sold in the U.S. must be safe. There are no exceptions. This requirement for safety applies equally to bioengineered foods and those produced through any other methods or means. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act regulations that FDA promulgated to deal with this ensures that the primary responsibility for demonstrating and ensuring safety rests with the seller of those foods, which is as it should be, if for no other reason than that if they sell foods that winds up being unsafe, they can be held legally liable for this. So how does this work with bioengineered foods in particular? You sometimes hear complaints or criticisms that the FDA's consultation process for bioengineered foods is voluntary. Well, it's de jure voluntary, but it's de facto mandatory. It's voluntary in the sense that the contract that Vito Corleone offered up and said that he wanted either your brains or the signature on this contract, that's about how voluntary it is. No food has been placed on the market in the United States without going through this consultation process. No corporate counsel would allow a company to expose themselves to the liability they would incur if they didn't go through this consultation process. It is also a fact that I think that there are good legal reasons, and I'll defer to Greg, I think there are good legal reasons that this process should remain voluntary rather than be made mandatory, but the biotech companies that have produced the improved seeds from which these crops and foods are derived, they have been on record for more than the past decade as supporting making this voluntary consultation process mandatory. Their reasoning being that they are going to go through this consultation process anyway, so why not just make it mandatory and deprive the opponents of a useful rhetorical club that they've been that they have used to raise doubts and to beat the biotech companies around the head and shoulders. But the 1992 policy statement that the FDA published in the Federal Register defines their consultation process, and this consultation process that they have defined is based on and derived directly from more than a decade's worth of work by expert scientific groups, worldwide bodies of expert scientific groups under the authority of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's expert working groups. And all of their studies over a decade's worth of work can be found at the link that's provided here. And the last link on this slide provides the website for the list of all the consultations that have been completed between folks who put foods on the market and the FDA to date. This slide is almost illegible, but it's cribbed directly from the FDA's consultation website. And what it does is it lays out the kinds of questions that FDA asks in the consultation process, which points at the answers that must be required before the consultation process will be considered to be complete. To make a very long story short, every reasonable question that one can imagine relating to the safety of bioengineered foods is asked in the consultation process and must be answered before they can be placed on the market. Those who claim safety is an issue are either misinformed or driven by some other motive, and sometimes both. An interesting series of documents appeared in late August, coming from the Advisory Committee on Recombinant Ethics in the United Kingdom, which is an expert body of scientists that the United Kingdom has established to advise them on policy relating to, I hate to say it, but GMOs. And they reached a number of conclusions in the series of 3 reports that they published in late August, which all can be found at the link that's included on this page. And they find that it is clear that the introduction of one or a few genes into an existing variety of plant represents a very small alteration in comparison to that which exists across the natural spectrum. The adoption of a regulatory approach based on how the genome of an organism is modified rather than on the novel characteristics that this change confers is not reconcilable with the knowledge that we now have about the plasticity of genomes. Our understanding of genomes does not support a process-based approach to regulation, which is exactly what mandatory GMO labeling would do. In summary, it's not about safety. GMO labeling is not about safety. It is not, in fact, about right to know. There are multiple avenues for information on this topic, and none of it has been hidden under a bushel. It's all widely available. If my colleagues don't touch on it, I'll be happy to expand in the discussions. It's also not about freedom to choose. Those who claim they want a label so they can avoid foods derived from crops and fruits or biotechnology have that capability right now, here today, in the United States. If they want to avoid biotech-derived crops and foods, they can simply choose something carrying the USDA organic label, which prohibits the knowing use of biotechnology by organic producers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Val. And now we'll turn to Greg.
Thank you, Darren, and thanks, Val, for setting the stage there. It's very useful. I think if you were to leave now, you would leave with a great deal of information that would be very useful. But since we did come to talk about labeling, I want to follow up on some of the things that Val talked about vis-a-vis the safety of what we're calling GMOs versus other more conventionally derived plants and foods. And although there's been a tremendous amount of discussion in the news media lately, the last couple of years, over the labeling of GM or GE foods, the labeling issue has actually been around as long as there have been genetically engineered foods on the market. As long ago as 1993, the state of Vermont enacted a statute that would require dairy products from cows treated with the genetically engineered growth hormone recombinant bovine somatotropin to be labeled as from RBST or RBGH. That was later overturned by a court on constitutional grounds. We'll come back to that in a minute. But the point of starting back in 1993 was to explain that there's really nothing new under the sun here. What is different is the renewed emphasis on labeling. For most of the last 2 decades, labeling has essentially been a subsidiary issue by activists whose primary purpose or primary goal was to drive products off the market by getting bans or other restrictions enacted. Fortunately, they have been uniformly, at least in the United States, uniformly unsuccessful in enacting bans, and more recently have taken a strategic shift to focus on the other end, or the consumption end, of the GMO public acceptance issue. A couple of different tactics that they've employed. One includes nuisance litigation to make the regulatory approval process much more expensive and much more time-consuming, decreasing the desire of seed breeders to go through the process because it's very difficult and very expensive to bring a new genetically engineered plant to market. As Val described, only the Food and Drug Administration process for getting a food on the market. Plants that are genetically engineered to be grown in the United States have to be approved by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which Val knows all about, having once been a regulator. And most of them, depending on the particular traits that are incorporated into the plants, most of them also have to be approved by the Environmental Protection Agency. So the nuisance litigation that has become a fact of life for the biotechnology industry since about 2005 has added substantially to the cost and complexity of bringing a product to market. But activists have primarily in recent years focused their attention on labeling. They have, for the last 20 years, tried to get Congress to enact legislation mandating labeling of genetically engineered foods with no success. They've tried repeatedly to petition the Food and Drug Administration, go to court to force the Food and Drug Administration to change its current policy on the labeling of genetically engineered foods, all unsuccessfully. So they have shifted their attention in recent years to the state level, where they have unfortunately received a much greater attention and ability to get these proposals taken very seriously. Now, Val described briefly the approval process, or the voluntary consultation process for getting a new food to market through the Food and Drug Administration. What he did not describe was the Food and Drug Administration's current labeling policy for genetically engineered foods. Now, some of you who are new to this issue may say, well, if FDA already has a labeling policy, why are we even talking about this? And the reason is the FDA's labeling policy is one that is science-driven. It is based on the material changes that occur within a food. So it applies across the board to any new food variety, regardless of how it was developed, including those developed with genetic engineering. So if a material change is made in the composition of the food, that is, a change in the level of dietary nutrients, vitamins and minerals, or carbohydrates or fats, or an increase in the background level of a natural plant chemical that can be toxic or allergenic or an anti-nutrient. Any of these things have to be changed, even to the point of a change in the taste or texture or mouthfeel of a product so that it will be different from what a consumer ordinarily would expect from the food, or change in something like the storage or preparation characteristics, the shorter shelf life for a food product. Any material change in the composition of the food has to be put on the label. That's important because it tells consumers exactly what's been done to the food and not what breeding method was used. Telling them only that genetic engineering was used to modify the plant from which a food product was derived doesn't actually give consumers any material information. So, as I said, activists finding no receptive audience here in Washington have moved out to the state level where they've gotten much greater reception. Many of you will have read about Proposition 37, ballot initiatives on California ballots last November. It initially had overwhelming popular support as late as the end of August in 2012. Survey research done by Pepperdine University had the Prop 37 leading, the yes vote on 37 leading the no vote by a full 40 percentage points. And on election day, because of the efforts of scientists primarily at the University of California system, but also some financial resources by the food industry and the biotechnology industry, were able to convince consumers in California to vote against Prop 37, and it failed by a relatively slim margin, something like 2 percentage points after all the absentee ballots were counted. This year we've got another ballot initiative in Washington State, Initiative 522. It is almost the exact same language as used in California, with some minor tweaks that lessons learned from the battle in California. And that'll be on Washington State ballots on November 5th. We'll have to hold our breath and wait and see what happens there. Currently, again, the favorability surveys are leading the opposition. The good news is that major and minor newspapers in Washington State have been persuaded by scientists that vote in favor of mandatory genetically engineered food labeling would be bad for Washington State consumers. And nearly every newspaper that I know of that has staked out a position on I-522 in Washington State has editorialized against it, including very recently the Seattle Times. Aside from the initiative process, there have also been bills introduced in at least 20 states in the last couple of years, 2 of which merit special mention, Connecticut and Maine. In Connecticut, earlier this year, the state legislature and governor enacted a statute that will require labeling of genetically engineered foods, but only once a trigger has been met of at least 4 other states with a total of not less than 20 million people, one of which has to neighbor Connecticut. Once they all enact similar labeling legislation, then Connecticut's will go into place. In Maine, The state legislature enacted in June a very similar bill, almost identical language with the trigger mechanism in Connecticut. In July, Governor Paul LePage said publicly that he would sign the legislation. He has not done so. I don't quite know why. We haven't seen any news reports as to why. Hopefully the governor is actually being convinced by scientists that this would be a bad move and ultimately will either veto or otherwise dispose of that legislation. So why are the state level efforts getting so much traction? Partly, I think it's because of popular support. If you ask people in survey research, they'll tell you, of course, if you ask them, if they ask a random sample of Americans whether they'd like additional information about almost anything, they will say yes. So it's unsurprising that in survey after survey for the last 15 years, that we have seen consistent high levels of support for mandatory genetically engineered food labeling. But again, one has to wonder how much to credit this level of public support. It does seem to be very broad, but how deep is it really? Again, if you ask people if they'd like some additional information, particularly about something as important to them as the food that they're eating, they will say yes. As one interesting example, a survey by the Center for Science and the Public Interest about 10 years ago asked a random sample of Americans whether they supported biotech food labeling. Unsurprisingly, the answer was yes by a large majority. Nearly half also said that they would support mandatory labeling of products made from crossbred corn. Crossbred corn. Since nearly all of the corn grown in the United States is of crossbred or hybrid varieties, it would be essentially like mandating bottled water producers to say includes hydrogen and oxygen on the label. It really adds no useful information. In fact, much like saying that a product was made with genetic engineering. If you give people a little bit more information, on the other hand, what you find is a change in attitudes and somewhat more nuanced responses. An organization here in Washington called the International Food Information Council has done a series of surveys every year for the last, I believe the 18th one just came out earlier this summer, where they ask consumers a range of questions about dietary habits and nutrition and food safety questions, including biotechnology, but not exclusive to biotechnology. They also ask about support for mandatory labeling, but before they ask the question, they tell respondents, give them a brief summary of FDA's current policy. What they find is that after being informed what the FDA's policy is, that is, compositional changes in the food that are material to human health or nutrition have to be put on the label, you see support for mandatory labeling fall dramatically and support for FDA's position winning by majorities. So public support aside, let's come back to the issue that Val raised earlier. Don't consumers have a right to know what's in their food? If so, how far does that extend? And what does it even mean to have a right to know what's in your food? I mean, after all, genetic engineering isn't something that's in the food. It's just a precursor breeding method. One of many that, as Val explained, results in fairly substantial genetic modifications to plants and animals. Ultimately, what makes a food safe or not is whether you've made a material compositional change, if you've changed the level of nutrients, if you've changed the level of natural toxins, or if you've added a new component that will be toxic or allergenic or in some other way harmful to consumers. It's that information that consumers actually want to know when they say, we want to know what we're eating, we want to know what's in our food, but that's the information that the Food and Drug Administration labeling policy already requires. Again, telling people made with genetic engineering doesn't give them any material information about the change of the food. It just says one particular breeding method was used to produce this crop. And it's really quite interesting. Again, Val touched on this, so I won't go into it at any length. But a lot of the same kinds of traits that plant breeders are using recombinant DNA technology, genetic engineering, to introduce into crop plants are also and can also be introduced into crop plants with one or another form of conventional breeding. So we hear a lot about herbicide tolerance. You know, it's one that is a big pet peeve of the environmental left. Herbicide tolerant, genetically modified plants, all they do is they let chemical companies sell more herbicide. Well, you can also use any number of conventional breeding methods to make a plant herbicide tolerant, and in fact there are many more conventionally bred herbicide tolerant varieties on the market today than there are genetically engineered ones. But environmentalists and consumer advocates only seem to be concerned about genetically engineered herbicide tolerant varieties. You go across the board with essentially any of the traits that we're talking about, they can all be produced with recombinant DNA technology or conventional breeding technology. It turns out that because of the relative or comparative precision of genetic engineering, where you're moving a single gene or a small number of known and characterized genes, you know exactly what the gene does, what protein the gene is going to produce in the plant. Those varieties, we can have a great deal of confidence that they are at least as safe and generally safer than conventionally bred ones, where we really don't know what's going on in the genome or the genetic composition of the plant. All we can do is, after the fact, kind of look at it and run some basic analytical studies to see if things have been changed. You know a heck of a lot more with recombinant DNA technology. Another thing that makes the anti-genetic engineering movement so frustrating is that in the midst of all their alleged concern about the introduction of toxins or allergens in genetically engineered plants, they're sort of missing the elephant in the room. And I want to give two examples of conventional breeding techniques that are very clearly, and should be obvious even without any additional information, are very clearly less precise and therefore less safe than recombinant DNA technology, but things that the anti-biotechnology activists and labeling advocates completely ignore and don't seem to care about at all. One is called wide cross or interspecific hybridization. Now, you know what hybridization is? That's mating one corn plant with another corn plant. Well, wide crosses involve mating a cultivated plant with another plant of a different species, or even at times in a different genus, ones that are very distant relatives that ordinarily would not be able to mate in the wild. They could only be reproduced in a laboratory environment. You very often, with wide cross hybridization, mating a cultivated plant with a wild progenitor that has very high levels of natural toxins. So potatoes, for example, wild potatoes have a very high level of a glycoalkaloid toxin called solanine that is in wild potatoes in high enough concentrations that it could make you very sick, and if you ate too much of it could kill you. Okay? So you've got potato breeders using wide cross hybridization to mate a cultivated potato with a wild progenitor potato with high levels of toxins. These are not subject to any sort of regulation whatsoever. They're considered conventional breeding, and nobody seems to care about them. The other one that I want to talk about that I think is a little bit more telling is called mutation breeding. And mutation breeding is essentially what it sounds like. You expose usually plant seeds, sometimes clusters of cells or young plants, to ionizing radiation from an X-ray or cobalt-60 source, or douse seeds or plant cells in a petri dish with a mutagenic chemical for the purpose of randomly scrambling the DNA in a plant. Most often, this will kill the plant cells outright or render them sterile. Occasionally, you'll get the kind of creature from a black lagoon mutations that you might expect from zapping a plant with ionizing radiation or a mutagenic chemical. But on very rare occasions, perhaps 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 50,000 organisms, you will get an agronomically useful mutation. That plant is then cultivated, grown out, tested for basic appearance variety type testing, not anything sophisticated like chemical composition analysis, and then enters a breeding program where the mutated plant actually becomes the parent of a cultivated line of varieties. There are on the market in the last 50 years an order of magnitude more mutant varieties. The International Atomic Energy Association in Vienna keeps a record of voluntarily reported radiation mutated varieties. The last time I checked, it was over 2,250 entrants in the IAEA database. There are undoubtedly many more that have been made with ionizing radiation, and probably thousands of others made with chemical mutation. There are fewer than 100 genetically engineered plants that have been approved for growing in the United States. All right. Do labeling advocates insist that these products be labeled because consumers have a right to know what's in their food? If they do, I've never heard of it. Never once in my 18 years working on this issue heard a labeling advocate or an anti-genetic engineering advocate say that we need more regulation of mutated crops. I'm not sure why that is, but it's interesting that this right to know, universal right to know what's in our food would be so specific to a single breeding technique, and one that scientists universally believe is at least as safe, if not safer, than even more conventional breeding techniques like basic simple hybridization. So what about this right to force producers to put a label on genetically engineered foods? So consumers certainly have a right to ask for information. Val mentioned earlier that a consumer that wants to avoid genetically engineered plants, all he needs to do is go and buy a certified organic food. But that's not the extent of it. I mean, there are on U.S. grocery store shelves today more than 10,000 explicitly labeled non-GE food products available for consumers to buy. There are activist groups like Greenpeace and the Genetic Right to Know campaign that produce shopper's guides. Even you can even get a smartphone app to help you find products that are not genetically engineered, right? So consumers have information that they need to buy the kinds of products that they want to buy, those that do not contain or don't have a genetically engineered organism as a progenitor. But more importantly, federal courts have held that it is in fact a violation of the First Amendment to force producers of food to put something on their label that does not bear a reasonable relation to consumer health or safety or another compelling governmental interest. This was actually put to the test in the Vermont labeling case that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. Made itself all the way up to the Second Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals, where the Court of Appeals held that the Vermont labeling statute violated the First Amendment because a consumer curiosity about whether or not a plant was or a food product was derived from genetic engineering is not a sufficient, not a compelling governmental interest. It's something that consumers can get information about from the marketplace. If they want to buy non-GE foods, they can go to producers that sell non-GE foods. But unless there is a material impact on consumers, you can't force producers to put something on their label. And that's not the only hurdle that state labeling laws, at least, face. Section 403A of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act actually preempts state labeling laws. It says that, quote, no state may directly or indirectly establish any requirement respecting any claim made in the label or labeling of food that is not identical, essentially, to another part of the statute, but standards set by the Food and Drug Administration. Because the Food and Drug Administration has a policy on the labeling of genetically engineered foods, a state labeling mandate that is different from that would be preempted by the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Again, this too has been put to test in litigation. in a case out in California called Briceno versus Conagra Foods. Conagra is the maker of Wesson canola oil. Canola is a food product that in North America at least, the vast majority of canola is produced from genetically engineered plants. Wesson cooking oil has genetically engineered progenitor canola in it. So Briceno and a couple of other consumer activist plaintiffs sued to say that A, Conagra shouldn't be allowed to call Wesson cooking oil all natural, and B, under California anti-fraud laws, the court should require canola or require Conagra to label Wesson cooking oil as genetically engineered. The district court judge in the Central District of California concluded, based on the language in Section 403A of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, that under California law you can't do that because it's explicitly preempted by the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So state labeling laws are doomed to failure on at least two grounds: constitutional and statutory preemption, which I think ultimately is going to render most of this activity at the state level moot. It will take time, it will take an awful lot of money, it will be acrimonious and entail litigation in federal courts, but ultimately what we're going to find is that, just like the state of Vermont found in 1996 when that case was decided, you just can't do it at the state level until we identify some real reason to be concerned about genetic engineering. You can't force food manufacturers to say so on the label. Again, in closing, all of that is immaterial because consumers already have the choice that they say they want. They can go to grocery stores. I mean, you know, you don't even have to go to the organic market anymore to find these things. You go to Safeway or Giant or even Walmart, and you can find affirmatively labeled non-genetically engineered foods supplying consumers with all of the choice that they say they want. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. Julie, saw you. Thanks.
Before I start, I want to tell Val that my remarks are riddled with the acronyms, you know, GM and GMO. So I apologize for that in advance. Greg and Val obviously talked a lot about the science and the labeling issues. I'm going to focus on another part of the issue, what I consider to be a very powerful and emerging yet somewhat overlooked force in the anti-GMO movement, and that is the activist blogger, the activist mom, the mommy blogger, and the media sources that target women. In short, you know, I've got about 10 minutes of remarks here, but I'll just boil it down for you. Like the Republican Party, the biotech industry has a woman problem. And as a mother, as a blogger, as a woman, these are issues that mean a lot to me. Some of the most powerful anti-GMO activists and messaging doesn't come from Greenpeace and the other activist environmental organizations. It comes from mommy blogs, parenting, cooking, so-called health and wellness websites, even fitness websites. You see it in women-centric publications like magazines and daytime television programs. These sources have really begun to promote anti-GMO messages. But this isn't sort of the natural outgrowth of these environmental groups. This is the strategy being employed by these groups. These activists are eager to scare the wits out of the American public and out of the consumer in order to change consumer habits and to create a demand for either the banning or labeling of GMO products. This targeting of the American consumer makes this a uniquely women's issue. That's because 9 out of 10 women are the primary shopper in their families. Women are the leading buyers of everything in this country, from cars to light bulbs to groceries. And they are also the primary caretakers of children. Anti-GMO activists understand this, they understand women, and they know that if they want to change the purchasing habits of Americans at large, they need to target women, particularly mothers. Women are bombarded with terrifying messages on a daily basis. And it's not just with GMOs. From their household cleaners to the trace amounts of flame retardants in the children's Halloween costumes that they just purchased, to so-called, and I'm not kidding you, toxic garden hoses, and being told that their children's rain gear is going to kill them. Of course, if they're eating it, but no children are generally eating their raincoats. To myths about dangerous levels of pesticide residue on the common apples you buy in the grocery store, to the anti-vaccination zealots. Women are being fed a near constant diet of misinformation about food, medicine, technology, and common everyday products. IWF has actually done some polling in this issue, on these issues, and it's pretty depressing and revealing about how women think. As you can see up here, according to our poll, 68% of the women that were polled for our research said the world is becoming a more dangerous place. This was really stunning to some of us who follow these issues when we know that we're healthier, we're living longer, disease-free, water is cleaner, air is cleaner, food is more abundant and more reliable. It's just not true that the world is becoming more dangerous, and yet women clearly feel frightened in the world they're living in. The next data point I wanted to show you was 66% of women said they're not doing enough to provide them and their families with healthy food. That's never going to change. I, as a mother, am riddled with guilt on a daily basis, and I think that's pretty common, but I wanted to include this one because I think it's important. It's an important part of how women think. This was really interesting. 83% of women said they have trouble telling the difference between a legitimate scientific study and one that is designed to scare them. That is not surprising in today's day and age, with the incredible proliferation of junk science and organizations that have no ethical problem with promoting studies that don't meet the basics of scientific standards. Lastly, 87% of women report having a tough time finding sources on health and wellness information that they can trust. Each of these data points offers a somewhat glum window into the psyche of the modern American woman. But taken together, they represent the perfect incubator for anti-GMO sentiment. Anti-GMO activists and their allies on the left understand that moms are overwhelmed, they're scared, they feel tremendous doubt and guilt about their own decisions, and they simply don't know who to trust and are overwhelmed by the conflicting information on these issues. Given this mindset, it's no wonder that moms are often swayed by well-meaning mommy bloggers, friendly-looking health and wellness bloggers who tell them that they should support GMO labeling because you deserve to know what you're feeding your children. The implication, of course, being that GMOs are dangerous and the label will only be used to avoid them. Some mommy bloggers even go so far to claim very scary health problems with their children. They don't necessarily have to provide the medical evidence for this, and will say things like, after going GMO-free, everything got better. In other words, children are often used as props by anti-GMO activists. Understandably, this appeals to many mothers, particularly moms who feel nervous and overwhelmed. And I have to be honest with you, I don't find these issues to be particularly easy to learn about. This is not going on Pinterest and figuring out how to make the perfect bumblebee cupcakes. These are complicated issues. They take time and dedication to learn about and to understand. And we all know that that's something, time and dedication to these subjects, moms might not have the time to concentrate on. That makes moms vulnerable to the allure of the better safe than sorry rule. That's mommy speak for the regulatory term called the Precautionary Principle, which is the norm in Europe. And it basically says that, we don't know if it's harmful, but let's just ban it or regulate it just to be safe. That's extremely dangerous, and that is where we're going with these types of policies that many of the anti-GMO activists want us to pursue. Again, The precautionary principle, or the better safe than sorry principle, is very attractive to busy moms. It relieves them of having to actually make a decision or learn about a subject while allowing them to be cautious and take action. Women need to understand the costs associated with these regulations. It means more limits, more bans, and more importantly, higher costs. It also means growing government, which according to our poll, a vast majority of women oppose, at least when it comes to their food choices. I think it's also critical that the food industry and the biotech industry do a better job to help mothers understand the safety of this technology and the safety of this food. Women need to understand the cost will be passed to the consumer, a consumer that's already struggling in this economy. And they need to understand that things like the testing in order to label these foods will be substantial. It will require the redesign and repackaging of every single product in the grocery store to accommodate the labeling requirements. One thing that isn't often mentioned by the anti-GMO activists is the impact that will have on small food producers and small farmers. You know, this massive relabeling project will be doable for some of the larger food manufacturers, but for the small upstarts, the medium-sized food companies, and small farmers, this could be crushing. The regulatory and legal nightmare that would unfold just trying to enforce the labeling rules is mind-boggling. Who is ultimately responsible for the label? What if the store accidentally accepts something that's mislabeled? Is the store responsible to certify that the manufacturers have indeed labeled something correctly? It's important to understand that while many of these anti-GMO activists rally against biotechnology, they are usually the first to be critical of big, scary ag, corporate farms, and big food companies. Yet GMO labeling efforts, which they support, will force many of these small farmers and small food producers out of business as they fail under the weight of these regulations. For women and for mothers, that means fewer choices in the marketplace, less competition, and ultimately a much less happy consumer. Women also need to understand the real intentions of the GMO activists. They like to say it's labeling food, empowering the consumer to know what they're feeding their children, but ultimately it's to destroy the biotech industry. I'm not going to read these, but take a look at these quotes. It's about destroying the biotech industry. It's about market rejection and consumer rejection. It's about getting the consumers to simply refuse to buy GMO products. Women need to be reassured that GMO labeling is already happening in the form of organic labeling, as Greg talked about. If you want to avoid GMOs, it's easy. You stick to the fresh produce aisle, you know what oils to cook in, you avoid processed foods. This isn't hard. Women need, most importantly, to reject the false narrative of danger around every corner, whether it's GMOs or many of the other products out there. And they need to be wary of the casual rejection of science and the experts out there reassuring people that these products are safe. And they need to stop being pawns to radical environmentalists eager to kill this promising new technology. This is my advice.
Thank you, Julie. I know we're running a little behind, so thanks for your patience. There'll be plenty of time for Q&A, and then we'll have lunch with genetically modified food. So let me just ask one quick question, so I want to get to the Q&A. What's the harm in having, from the consumer perspective, if I'm just a consumer, why not just give me that information? How would that somehow misinform me or hurt me in any way? Okay.
I'll take a crack at this. The reliability and the dependability of a food label is something that is personally very important to me. My son has a life-threatening allergy to peanuts. I don't want anything to be done to food labels to erode my ability to have confidence that the information on those labels is accurate, informative, and not misleading, as is required by the FDA under law. I know that the only foods that are screened in advance to eliminate the potential or reduce the potential for allergenicity are those that are produced or derived through biotechnology. So having a positive label produced through biotechnology would give me a sense of security, and that's what we basically have with the labels that we have now. We know that with the existing FDA policy, that as Greg said, any material change that affects nutrition, health, or safety of the food must be indicated on the label. Putting information on labels to satisfy curiosities that stem from whatever source, but which are not material to health, safety, or nutrition. I think there are a variety of voluntary ways to meet those desires, but I think mandating it by government in a way that that will further confuse consumers and undermine confidence in the accuracy of information on labels is absolutely deplorable public policy.
And if I could just add, I mean, even beyond harm to consumers, which, plenty of studies find that the more information on a food label, the harder it is to find information, even if it's all accurate and not misleading. There are cases in pharmaceutical litigation where courts have actually held that putting too much information on a pharmaceutical label is a negligent failure to warn by a pharmaceutical manufacturer, because it does in fact make it harder for the patient to find the information. Putting too much information on a food label can do exactly the same thing and run exactly the same problem. And there's only so much space allotted. Tell us what we really need to know, and otherwise give the manufacturer the right to put what he wants that's truthful and not misleading on the label, and let consumers make the choice. Beyond harm to consumers is harm to producers, right? Julie touched on this earlier when she said, well, what if a retailer accepts a product in its store that is unintentionally mislabeled? Who bears liability for that? Well, at least under California's Prop 37, the retailer would have. Ironically, mandatory labeling may be more costly for companies that want to remain GE-free, because if you know you've got a genetically engineered ingredient in your food product, you change your label, that's some cost. But if you want to be GE-free, you have to go to the process of either independently testing every shipment of ingredients or getting a sworn certification from every one of your suppliers that the product is in fact not genetically engineered. Under California's Prop 37, those are the only two ways to protect yourself from liability for an accidental mislabeling. It's very costly to have to go through that process, even for companies that don't have anything to do with genetic engineering.
Yeah, I'm just going to add one thing. We actually have Americans pay the least amount for their groceries. We're lucky if you compare us to other countries. We're very lucky. Our food costs have gone up a bit over the last couple of years, but in general, we have very low costs of food. And these kinds of efforts are the way in which we're going to start making food a lot more expensive. And I think for consumers out there who are trying to deal with a lot of other unexpected costs, that's going to be a real shock to them.
Thanks. Any questions in the audience? Okay, let's start here up front.
Hi, Kimberly.
Hey, actually, could you say your name and affiliation when you do ask a question, if you can? Thanks.
Kimberly Reed. I'm with the International Food Information Council, so I appreciated hearing your citation of our survey data. Just like for you to look in the crystal ball a little bit, and globally, if we would happen to have mandatory labeling on biotech foods in this country, what kind of fear would that put into consumers, and what kind of message would that send globally, as our population is going to go from 7 to 9 billion people, and we're blessed with a lot of land and food in this country, but other parts of the world that are looking at commercializing biotech are having a hard time right now just dealing with the activists to build acceptance in those countries. So just kind of curious about your thoughts on what would happen if this would be mandated.
Well, I'll take a stab at that. I think the bigger issue is less with spreading fear to consumers than it is spreading fear to food processors and packagers and retailers. Ultimately, I imagine if you had mandatory labeling, there would be some non-negligible number of consumers who would deselect. I think already you are seeing a market for affirmatively labeled non-GE food products. So to suggest that it would have no impact on consumer behavior is probably naive. I don't think it would be tremendous. On the other hand, losing a small percentage of your customer base, having what's known in the industry as customer deselection of a food product, is something that a food retailer or a food processor may not want to suffer. I mean, profit margins in the food industry tend to be very, very thin. Like Amazon, they make it up on volume. But if a food retailer, particularly a large multinational food processing company, Kraft or Nestle or General Mills, these are companies that protect the reputations of their brands very assiduously, very carefully, and they're not going to want to lose 5% of their customers or 10% of their customers to a competitor who may offer something that that small portion of the consumer base may want instead. So I suspect the issue would be food company and retailer deselection of the technology, which ultimately would lead to killing biotechnology in the crib.
I think Greg is right, and I think that his comments point to an irony here. Most of the opponents of agricultural biotechnology target the technology providers, companies like Monsanto. Monsanto is the favorite whipping boy. But the fact is that every single product that Monsanto sells carries a label that makes very clear what it is that they're selling. It's not the tech providers who are so opposed to labeling of foods derived through biotechnology. It's the food companies that Greg mentioned. Kraft, General Mills, Kellogg, these big, these big food companies, they have multiple independent brands, any one of which are worth more, are valued more highly than the entire market capitalization of all the tech providers taken together. And it's those folks, they're not just concerned about potentially losing 5% of market share. Those brand managers are concerned about losing 0.1% of market share. Those folks are extremely conservative, and they're responsible for portfolios that are worth hundreds of billions of dollars. So they take potential threats to their brands very seriously. And given the quotes that Julie put up there from some of the activists who are arguing for these labels, we know it is their intent to perpetrate a fraud on the American consumer. It is their intent to mislead them about the safety of these products, to drive them to deselect them, because they want to drive these products out of the market.
Any more questions? Okay, Ryan, middle.
Hi, I'm Paul Weiner from Beyond Systems. The FDA's website confirms that it actually does not perform or require independent testing of GMOs to assure safety, but merely encourages voluntary consultations. In the letters the FDA sends out to the developers of the GMO developers after completion of the studies, doesn't give its own opinion, but just cites the assurances by these developers. My question to you is: Are you confident that in the assurances by these developers, both domestic and foreign GMO developers, that the insecticides, fungicides, and other toxins they insert into these crops are and will be safe for humans and the environment, both now and future products?
That's a science question. Shall I go first?
Please.
I would be much happier if the FDA, if the policymakers at FDA would tell their lawyers, thank you for your advice, this is what we're going to do, and then made an affirmative and very clear, non-Jesuitical legal declaration that this review has indeed resolved any potential questions. There are no concerns. This food product is safe and free to go onto the market. I'd be much happier if they would do that. But because they have valued the input of their lawyers on this more than they have their scientists, that results in the verbiage that you cite, which is unfortunate, I think. Having said that, every other major country in the world that has regulations on these food safety issues requires these sorts of reviews. And they review the exact same dossiers that FDA looks at. And they reach the same conclusions that these products are safe. And as I said in my presentation, that illegible slide which listed all the questions that are captured in the FDA's consultation process, that's derived from a decade's worth of work by expert working groups under the OECD that looked at numerous angles around all of this and which laid out the kinds of questions you'd have to ask and the kinds of answers you'd have to be confident in the safety of these foods derived from crops improved through biotechnology. And as I said, every single one of those foods has gone through this process. Whether it's voluntary here or not, it's mandatory elsewhere, and the views are identical in content. And there's, as I said, every single reasonable question that can be asked is asked and answered before these foods go onto the market. They are safer. The Europeans who've looked at this, the European scientists who've looked at this have concluded, as in the link that I provided in one of my slides, that foods derived through biotechnology are likely to be safer than others because of the unprecedented a priori scrutiny they receive.
So we should trust the answers from the developers?
No, I'm not saying you trust the answers from the developers. I'm saying you trust the
Okay,
answers.
let's do one more question real quick, and then
If I could,
I mean
just
very
briefly.
briefly.
Why genetically engineered crops and not mutant varieties, right? Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that FDA is just rubber stamping every application that comes in. That would mean that the amount of scrutiny given to genetically engineered crop varieties is no different from any other variety, many of which we know to be made with processes that are more risky than recombinant DNA technology. I put the question back on you. Why aren't you concerned about them?
I'm sorry, insecticides, fungicides, and other
Well, we'll have a chance to discuss after the event. So one more quick question and then one quick answer.
Here in the U.S., we have lower longevity rates. We have no long-term science. We have increasing disease rates. We have farmers being sued to the rate of about 500 by companies like Monsanto. We have a lot of issues that a lot of people believe are tied to GMOs. Maybe there's no definitive proof, but a lot of scientists who are independent believe that there is a problem with GMOs. What's wrong with labeling?
Let me just say, what was your name and affiliation?
Mike
Sorry.
Snow, journalist.
Okay.
Well, I'm sorry, but the underlying premise of your question is faulty since we're actually seeing higher longevity. So,
That's not according to the information I have.
oh,
Among developed nations, we rank at or near the bottom.
but
Longevity today is decades longer than it was in the past.
Compared to developed nations, we're falling behind.
Longevity continues to increase. In the United States, it's increasing at a slower level than in some advanced countries, but it is still a positive slope, and there is no question about it. That's CDC morbidity data, which are out there in the literature. Your assertion that independent scientists are concerned about these issues is contradicted by the data. The references that I provided contain citations for thousands of papers, all of which contradict the assertion made in your question. There are a handful of scientists who do raise concerns, people like Don Huber and similar, and they are clearly well outside the mainstream of scientific thought on this, and their opinions have been falsified by tests. You and I have spoken previously about, for example, Seralini's study on rats or Carmen's study with pigs. Each of these studies, which claims to highlight safety issues with crops and foods improved through biotechnology has, under minimal scrutiny, been shown to be unsupported and not withstand even minimal analysis.
But when Monsanto itself calls for labeling in Europe loud and clear, it says it wants labeling, why can't we have it here? If they have it everywhere else?
Because it's not Monsanto's choice. It's the choice of the food packager, and under the Constitution, it's the choice of the people who are engaging in voluntary exchanges to ask for and get the information that they request.
Okay, we can follow up. I appreciate it. I do. Thank you, and join me in thanking the panel. Thank you.